Welcome to my channel. Fun facts about the world. Afghanistan. It's believed that chess originated in northern India, where the game was known as Chaturanga. Mother Teresa, the Nobel Prize winning humanitarian, was born in Skopje, which is now part of North Macedonia, but she was of Albanian ethnicity. The Sahara Desert covers around 80% of Algeria's land area. Andorra has no standing army and is one of the world's only two co-principality countries with the President of France and the Bishop of Argels in Spain as its co-princes. Angola is home to the giant stable antelope, a rare and critically endangered species known for its distinctive curved horns. Antigua and Barbuda is a twin island nation boasts 365 beaches, one for each day of the year. The country is known for its love of soccer, and it's home to some of the world's most famous footballers, including Diego Maradona and Lionel Messi. Armenia is considered one of the world's oldest Christian nations, adopting Christianity as its state religion in the early 4th. The Great Wall of China is not a single continuous wall, but a series of walls and fortifications built over centuries. India is the birthplace of major religions, including Hinduism, Buddhism, Jainism, and Sikhism. The United States is home to the world's first national park, Yellowstone National Park. Indonesia has the highest number of active volcanoes in the world, with over 130. The Karakoram Highway connecting Pakistan and China is the highest paved international road in the world. Brazil is home to the Amazon rainforest, often referred to as the lungs of the earth. Nigeria is the most populous country in Africa and is known for its diverse ethnic groups and languages. The Sundarbans mangrove forest in Bangladesh is home to Bengal tigers. Russia spans 11 time zones, making it the largest country by land area in the world. Mexico introduced chocolate, chili peppers, and corn into the world. Japan has one of the world's highest life expectancy rates, and it's home to the world's oldest hotel, Nishiyama Onsen Kyokan, founded in 705 AD. Ethiopia uses a unique calendar system, which is about 7 to 8 years behind the Gregorian calendar. The Philippines consists of 7,641 islands, making it the second largest archipelago in the world. The Great Pyramid of Giza is one of the seventh wonders of the ancient world and is believed to have been built around 4,500 years ago. The world's largest cave, Sandong, is located in Vietnam and it is so big that it has its own river and jungle. The Democratic Republic of Congo is the second largest country in Africa and is home to the world's largest lava lake at Mount Nyiragongo. Istanbul, Turkey is the only city in the world that spans two continents, Europe and Asia. Iran has one of the world's oldest continuous civilizations, dating back over 7,000 years. Germany is famous for its autobahn, where certain sections have no maximum speed limit. Thailand is known as the land of smiles due to its friendly and welcoming culture. The United Kingdom has no written constitutions, relying on a combination of statutes, common law, and conventions. The Eiffel Tower in Paris was originally intended to be a temporary structure for the 1889 World's Fair. Italy is home to the smallest country in the world, Vatican City, which is an independent city-state. South Africa is known for its big five wildlife: lion, leopard, elephant, buffalo, and rhinoceros. Myanmar has the world's largest book, the Kutoda Pagoda, which contains inscribed marble slabs with Buddhist scriptures. South Korea is known for its innovative pop culture, including K-pop, music, and Korean dramas. Colombia is one of the world's largest producer of emeralds. Mount Kilimanjaro in Tanzania is the tallest freestanding mountain in the world. Spain is known for its annual La Tomatina festival, where participants engage in a massive tomato fight. Ukraine is home to the deepest metro station in the world, the Arsenalna station in Kiev. Kenya is famous for its long-distance runner, including Olympic gold medalists. Argentina is known for its passionate tango dance, which originated in Buenos Aires. Poland is the birthplace of the famous astronomer Nicholas Copernicus. Lake Victoria, shared by Uganda, Kenya, and Tanzania, is the largest lake in Africa and the second largest freshwater lake in the world. Canada has more lakes than any other country in the world. Morocco is known for its colorful and bustling markets, known as souks. Iraq is home to the ancient city of Babylon, one of the world's earliest urban centers. Malaysia is known for its diverse cuisine influenced by Malay, Chinese, India, and indigenous flavors. The city of Samarkand in Uzbekistan is home to stunning Islamic architecture and is a UNESCO World Heritage Site. Saudi Arabia is home to the Rub Al Khali, the world's largest continuous sand desert. Peru is famous for Machu Picchu, an ancient Incan citadel located high in the Andes Mountains. Nepal is home to 8 of the world's 14 highest peaks, including Mount Everest. Angel Falls in Venezuela is the world's highest uninterrupted waterfall. Lake Malawi is home to the more fish species than any other lake in the world. The ancient city of Timbuktu in Mali was a center of learning and trade in medieval period. Kazakhstan's territory is so vast that it spans two continents, Asia and Europe. Syria is home to some of the world's oldest cities, including Damascus and Aleppo. Cambodia Angkor Wat is the largest religious monument in the world and a UNESCO World Heritage Site. The pink lakes of Reba and Dakar in Senegal get their colors from a type of bacteria that thrives in the high salt content. The Aloba Arc in Chad is one of the largest natural arches in the world, with a span of over 100 meters. Thank you for watching. Please subscribe.